Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. On October 27th last year, Elon Musk acquired Twitter for $44 billion US. Since acquisition, Musk has made three moves that substantively changed the nature of the platform for journalists. He began trialling a paid verification scheme. He laid off 75% of staff, including those responsible for online safety and content moderation, and he suspended the accounts of half a dozen prominent journalists under false allegations of doxing. What does this mean for journalists who make up about 25% of all verified users and who frequently cite Twitter as an incredibly important tool for both sharing and gathering information? We surveyed 13 of our journalist fellows and found 54% say they are using Twitter less, 15% have left Twitter, and 31% are using it the same amount. Asked what they thought might be viable alternatives, 58% mentioned LinkedIn, 16.7% Mastodon, 8% TikTok, and 16% said other. That's the briefing. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. I'm Caitlin Mercer, and today we're talking about That Bird site and the aftermath of Elmo's purchase. Don't at me if you're irked by what's said today. I'm personally not on Twitter anymore. Consider that my disclosure statement. But Dave Lee is, and he joins us from San Francisco today to talk about the fallout for journalists. Dave is a former BBC tech journalist and current San Francisco correspondent for the Financial Times, primarily covering e-commerce and the gig economy. He also writes about the societal impacts of new technologies for FT magazine and was an early adopter of the Mastodon experience. Welcome, Dave.
Hello, thanks for having me.
4:45 a.m. You're a dedicated man for joining us so early. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I thought we might as well kick off with a bit of a newsline. Elon Musk is in court at the moment with Tesla's shareholders, and you've been covering that story. What's the mood like in court? What's going on with that case?
Well, it's really interesting. I was there for the start of his testimony at the end of last week, and one thing that struck me was quite how nervous Musk seemed. He was being very, very careful with his words, which is, it's a contrast to how we kind of imagine him, don't we, as this kind of shooting from the hip figure. But there's a great deal at stake. I mean, investors say that Musk's Twitter habit when he said, funding secured to take Tesla private when he didn't have funding secured, it could cost him a huge amount of money. Certainly the most sort of risky lawsuit he's perhaps faced, and so it'd be interesting to see how it pans out. It shouldn't take long, couple more weeks maybe, and then we'll hear from what the jury makes of it. But it's yet another interesting court case for Musk. I feel like I've been to several now, but we'll see how that one pans out.
Yeah, were you live tweeting your coverage?
Live tweeting. I was more live Mastodoning for the first time, although it's quite the adjustment. I still don't have quite the audience on Mastodon that I've been lucky enough to have on Twitter. So there's an interesting trial run for that, I suppose.
What was the reaction like? What was different about Twitter versus Mastodon doing sort of?
I mean, for this case in particular, I mean the most obvious difference, as I'm sure will come as no surprise, is that when I refer to Elon Musk on Mastodon, I don't get this kind of flood of people saying horrible things to me, which that's become something of a mainstay of Twitter now. Anytime you do much reporting on Musk, you do get the small army of people telling you very clearly what they think of your reporting and also you as a person, which is always enjoyable. So that's the main difference specifically when it comes to Musk. I think what's what's quite interesting about Mastodon at the moment is that it's quite a small user base still, but it's pretty engaged, and a lot of people, especially on a subject like Elon Musk, are sort of ready to have decent conversations. A lot of people, particularly a lot of journalists that are on Mastodon, are there because they've decided not to use Twitter because of Elon Musk, and so there is an element of additional interest there. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, the act of reporting is the same, which I guess is somewhat encouraging. I think it'll just be interesting to see how that changes as Mastodon presumably gets bigger, or perhaps doesn't.
Perhaps doesn't. How viable do you think it is as an alternative? What are the pros and cons?
I mean, look, the big thing I hear, well, from immediate colleagues, is a good sort of place to start. I mean, I think people think it's perhaps overly complicated compared to Twitter. I'm not sure I buy that, really. I think it certainly takes a few moments to kind of get your head around, but I don't think it's much more than a few moments, frankly. And I'm reminded of those early days of Twitter, where I think a lot of us spent a good year or so sort of thinking, what do I do with this thing? And I remember at the time there was, people like Jonathan Ross would be on TV back home saying to people, you're on Twitter, what do you do on Twitter? So it was, the idea of how does the new platform work isn't something that's just related to Mastodon. I think it's almost as if the analogy I keep coming back to is that Twitter has turned into a sort of rough pub of the internet, where for years it's been somewhere where people have hung out under new management. There's a bit of a different crowd now. Some of us aren't too sure how to deal with that. Some of us still want to sort of nip in now and then and see our sort of old friends. Mastodon it's less explored. I think people are less not so much comfortable there, but it's been an interesting reset, isn't it? Because people coming from Twitter who have been used to thousands upon thousands of followers, all of a sudden they're almost starting from scratch, and so that's quite daunting for journalists as well. So it's certainly it's I think there's a hesitation to join just because it's new, it's lots of effort, and some of it is just slightly different. But I think all those things could probably be overcome.
I was discussing this with a colleague earlier, and kind of saying, I would like Mastodon to be a viable alternative, but the one thing that does seem to be missing for me is it's that element of discoverability on Twitter. The serendipity side of things doesn't seem to be there as much. It's a bit boring. There's not as much drama. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think this is the really interesting aspect, because one of the things I've noticed using Mastodon is that I will check in and I'll sort of see what replies there have been. I'll look over the feed for a moment, and then I'll almost feel like I've done it. I've done that session, and it's almost complete. Twitter certainly has that feeling of each time you look at it, there's something new. But I also think that's maybe a sort of a thing worth almost investigating, because what to me that suggests is that Twitter's been so good at just kind of grabbing your attention and holding it very, very tightly, primarily in the cause of trying to keep engagement higher, which is obviously one of their key metrics when they used to report to investors, and also serve you advertising and do all these things. And Twitter's algorithm has been both the thing that people have hated, but also it's the thing that makes Twitter feel more alive. I mean, I'm sure we've all sort of noticed, those of us still using Twitter, the algorithm seems to be going into overdrive right now. And in fact, one of the things Elon's put in place is this new For You kind of view, which is a lot more algorithmically, say that at 5 a.m. Generated, and there's people now appearing in my feed that I don't follow and have no intention of following, but all it does is serve to give you that sort of dopamine-y kind of stuff, which is something that's kind of Twitter's built on, really, isn't it? The dopamine feeling. Mastodon doesn't have that. Now, that could be seen as a benefit for just our state of mind. Certainly feels that way for me. But it does actually limit its chances of capturing as big an audience as perhaps it might have done before. So it's a bit of both there, I think.
Yeah, and that is the key thing, isn't it? Is who's going to actually capture the attention of the biggest audience? If we're looking for a viable alternative as a town square.
Yes, I think so. And also, sorry, I didn't.
No, please.
Well, I think there's a group on Mastodon that if you ask them, they said this is just as good as Twitter. Everyone's here now. We're all discussing, and I found that's true for perhaps people who work in cybersecurity or people who work in, kind of extremely online type work. What we haven't seen yet in any meaningful way on any platform beyond Twitter is, your footballers go there, or, the NBA stars here, or singers, or any kind of. And, while Twitter was built on techies, on journalists, on all that kind of stuff, it's worth saying that the platform didn't become the influential thing it was until normal people, if I can sort of say that, started to join and started to understand it. And indeed, the politicians, there's a few politicians on Mastodon, but nothing like what we see on Twitter, where just about every, congressman or whoever is on there. And we also yet to see in any large number some of the kind of groupings on Twitter move over to Mastodon. Sort of the cultural elements, and you have what people refer to as Black Twitter, which is a very sort of vibrant part of Twitter that hasn't really migrated to Mastodon. And so until that happens, I don't think we can call anything an alternative, whether a viable alternative. We can grow into that potentially, but there's a huge way to go until that happens. And looking at Mastodon's stats, I think they said a couple of days ago there were around 1.4 million active users of Mastodon. Well, Twitter's in excess of almost 300 million of what they call their monetizable users. So it's clearly still just a drop in the ocean, but I mean it's grown quickly.
And there's maybe a little bit of hubris among journalists thinking, oh, we're all on Mastodon now, so everyone's going to come here, when in fact Chrissy Teigen is not there, so no one's coming. Is that a fair summary?
I think you're right. I mean, Chrissy, until LeBron James is signing up, I'm not sure I'm too impressed. It is interesting, isn't it? Because journalists, and I say this with a degree of self-awareness, have a sense of self-importance when it comes to these things, thinking that we are the quality information on these platforms, and that's true to a certain point. But in the same way that often people used to buy newspapers not for the news but for the TV guide, people are signing up to these platforms not to see journalists jabbering away, but to sort of follow the things they're really interested in. And that's and should be a sort of humbling thing. And I also think it speaks back to this issue of the sort of great reset. If a journalist, I mean, I can include myself in this as well. My BBC job, because it was on TV and radio, my followers were much easier to come by than working for a newspaper. And so my Twitter audience is almost, more than half of people have came from my BBC days. So when you go to Mastodon, you don't have that initial,
plug.
It makes you think, well, what am I bringing to this platform? What is going to be my way to build an audience on Mastodon? I've got quite used to having one, thank you very much. And so so that's as big a part of the transition question for journalists as any other factor, I think.
I'm going to move on from Mastodon shortly, but before I do, tell us a little bit about your project to chronicle how many journalists are on Mastodon.
Project is right. It's so so Mastodon has this feature where if you have a website and you link to your profile with a particular bit of code, your Mastodon profile will have, it's like a sort of badge, it's like a kind of highlighted badge that says verified, a verified link, basically. And obviously verification on Twitter has become a big talking point, a big controversy. I think it's probably the largest single mistake Musk has made in changing that protocol and process. But of course, Mastodon isn't a centralized service, and so there isn't some team somewhere saying, right, this person's real, this person isn't. And so I made a website essentially it's a database of journalists, verified journalists, and each page in this database generates one of those links. So if you're added to the database, you get this box on your profile saying you've been verified by presscheck.org is the name of the site. And that's been useful, incredibly overwhelming when we had so many responses that we've verified maybe a third of everyone that's come in. So it's certainly given me a greater appreciation of the blue tick and how much of a ordeal that must have been for Twitter to administer. But I think as we kind of move into these new spaces, I think ways to verify certain kind of professions on these places, I think that becomes pretty important, because I do feel like we've got quite complacent about identity online, particularly with regards to Twitter. And we're seeing right now, when the blue tick is an $8 a month thing that anyone can add, that does change the usefulness of it. So anything that kind of counters that, I think is a worthwhile endeavor, even if it means my inbox is bursting with people complaining about us not verifying people quickly enough, but we'll get to it eventually.
Moving on from Mastodon, are there other viable alternatives we should be watching?
So there's a list. We have post.news is it's basically very similar to Twitter in terms of it's owned by one company. This had a lot of kind of chatter when it first launched. It was given a bit of hype by Kara Swisher, a very prominent tech journalist out here. So that had some early momentum. Last night, as I was waiting for a plane, I logged back into all these things that I've been using, and Post to me doesn't feel as anywhere near as alive as it needs to be for people to sort of log in and stay there. So I don't have high hopes for Post.news, although who knows. What is interesting is some of the splinter efforts from people who were at Twitter. So you have Spill, which is under development, and that is being built by an ex-team from Twitter. They describe themselves as a diverse team from across Twitter. So there's a sort of, speaking to that, what I was saying about Black Twitter, that they're kind of thinking of those communities as a way to perhaps have a revival of that in a different place. There's also another project which has the working title T2, which reminds me of Terminator more than anything. But that's another group of former Twitter engineers and also some Google engineers. And that looks pretty interesting. They're building that, trying to raise money. And one thing that struck me as interesting, and I was tweeting about some of these things yesterday, and someone got in touch to remind me that Zoom was a creation of disgruntled Cisco employees that left after a takeover. Disgruntled WebEx employees that left after Cisco took over that video platform, and they said, well, to hell with this, we'll make our own, and it ended up being Zoom. And so that, if anything, should really remind people how possible it is for talented, skilled, nimble engineers to create a viable alternative. So whether any of the ones out there right now are the Zoom of Twitter, I don't know, but there's certainly some very talented people looking at it.
Yeah. What would it take for one of those alternatives to be successful, and what is the role of journalism in creating that tipping point? I mean, you've covered it a little bit about bringing the Chrissies and the LeBrons, but do journalists have a role in deciding whether a platform will or won't be successful in terms of content creation?
I think we do. I think a lot of it hinges on whether journalists behave sort of appropriately for that space. So, for instance, on the poll you showed at the beginning there, I think it was something like 8% said TikTok might be a sort of place for journalists to go after Twitter. Obviously, TikTok's a very different place, right? It's not like Twitter. But that's not to say it can't be a platform from journalism. But what I think is really challenging for journalists on TikTok, particularly ones like me who feel very old now on a social network, which is something else entirely. But it's what is journalism's role in these places that don't really have much journalism? And indeed, like, do the users of TikTok want journalists there? I'm not really entirely convinced they do, if journalists are just going to act as normal. And I since moving to the US, I've always been quite obsessed with the way that local news anchors here all seem to sort of talk the same, in the same tone, and like, coming up tonight, and it's like, okay, well, good. And I've seen some of them go onto TikTok with that same presentational style. I'm thinking, what are you doing? Like, this isn't what TikTok users want. They want sincerity, they want authenticity. They're also smarter than we give young news consumers credit for. I think they know some of the sort of tricks of TV news. I don't mean tricks in a bad sense, but just sort of how stories are put together can sometimes, seem quite twee and old hat, and what they really want is just raw stuff. And so journalists need to learn from that. And actually, we can take encouragement from the rise of Twitter in the first place. These are all conversations that when Twitter was coming up, it was like, okay, well, what should journalists do, and should journalists be on there? And the thing that won out on Twitter, which was incredibly popular for journalists, was people seem to get a lot from journalists sort of describing the process more. And sort of giving commentary on, I'm going to do this interview, or, we've just lost such and such from our program because they can't make it because they're stuck on a train. All these kind of little bits of like making the news, the kind of the sausage, as they say. I mean, that actually, I think, enhanced trust. And so I wonder if some of these new platforms also need to reflect some of that. And TikTok in particular, I think the few things that has worked for journalists, organizations, is that sort of behind the scenes element of news gathering. And as long as we sort of meet users where they are, as opposed to just tell them, well, we're journalists, so you should listen, I think that can be useful.
Yeah, you said it earlier, the self-importance of thinking that your old way of doing things on your old format is completely different. Platforms must accept you as you come. Interesting. And you also mentioned the kind of chatter around the BBC newsroom when Twitter came out. Let's talk a little bit about the stereotype that journalists are a little anti-new tech. How fair do you think that is as a tech journalist? And do we need to do things differently?
I think, is it a stereo? I mean, yeah, it's a stereotype, like all stereotypes, kind of built somewhere on truth, isn't it? I think journalists are skeptical by nature, which is necessary. I also think we're often told something's the next big thing in various degrees. And so sort of a healthy dose of, I'll just wait and see is quite useful. I do think it's mildly frustrating to see journalists particularly those who cover technology, sort of saying services like Mastodon are too complicated, because I think that suggests an element of laziness there. I mean, we wouldn't have, if someone said, well, I think my iPhone's too complicated because I need to download some new apps. I mean, that's just doesn't make any sense. Sometimes I think, there'll be a certain number of early journalistic adopters, and we're seeing that already. Sometimes it needs more kind of upon high encouragement. There was a time when one of my early jobs, the BBC World Service, the radio network, and I imagine almost more than any other newsroom in the world, the BBC World Service had its fair few, let's just say, sort of lifers and old timers who would have hidden behind a big box of books and worked on, a science program somewhere, that kind of stuff, and doing incredible radio output, but was very much happy for the digital stuff to pass them by, which is, I do it. I now subsequently admire that, but at the time I judged it heavily. But there was a time when Peter Horrocks, who was running the World Service at the time, he once said in a meeting that he expects all of his journalists to be on Twitter, and gosh, that would set off this panic of people. And particularly at the time when I was there, and I was maybe 25, 26, people coming to me and saying, well, how do I use it? What do I do? And so maybe there'll be that moment for Mastodon, but frankly, I don't think the bosses quite understand Mastodon at all. So, that feels like quite a long way off. But I'm a big believer that journalists eventually will see where the audience is and go after it. I mean, that's no different to wanting to be on the front page or wanting to get on air. Twitter has been very important for reporters in a way of being able to sort of stick your finger in the air and see what the mood is, albeit the mood of the people who are on Twitter, which is not everybody, obviously. And I think if we're to lose that, which feels like a real risk at the moment, if we were to lose that, then I think the need for an alternative will be enough to get journalists out of that mode of just feeling that they don't really want to try the new thing.
Sure. I've got about 1,000 more questions for you, but I also have questions coming in from downstairs. Right. And if you're watching us on Zoom and you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function. In the meantime, let's go downstairs to the seminar room and speak to Tanmoy from India. There are just, I guarantee, hurriedly clicking to get the camera to turn on.
Sorry, Caitlin. Camera's not working. I'm going to work on that, but maybe
I'll tell you what's going on there. If my producer could make them a co-host, please, because cameras seem to be disabled. So if you could make them a co-host, that would really help. And while they get that sorted out, I'm going to ask you, Dave, to comment on something that horrifies me. And that is the suggestion that LinkedIn might be the alternative. What the blazes? What's going on?
I mean, LinkedIn. I mean, look, LinkedIn is tremendously useful, not least, in my current job, where every other day is a layoff day with one of the tech companies, and you see people on LinkedIn sharing things, and you can sort of slide into their LinkedIn DMs and say, I know this is one of the worst days of your career, but do you fancy a chat? So it's very useful for that. I'd hate to think LinkedIn is the next Twitter, just because I think what's been really fun about Twitter, and I've perhaps maybe used this too much in my career, but it's the fact that I can talk about work, but also make a crappy joke or talk about football or whatever. You can be more of your, I hate to use the phrase they love here, but more of your whole self on Twitter, which I feel awful for saying, but it's true. So I can see everyone now.
I'm not sure that LinkedIn can overcome its Microsoft baggage to be cool enough to be real, but That's my opinion. And nobody's here for my opinion. We're here for Dave's. And Tanmoy, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Dave. Thank you for speaking to us. I am one of those guilty of pimping my work on LinkedIn increasingly. So sorry about the nightmares, Caitlin. I want to ask you specifically about when platforms go rogue, there is this tendency to go into moral panic among a sense of users. This happened with Facebook long before Twitter. And I'm wondering whether you've experienced that sense of moral panic too, and has that played a role in your decision to engage with or disengage with Twitter, and will that be a long-term sort of sustainable feeling? Because there are some initial studies that show that a very small percentage of people who said that they will leave Twitter for righteous reasons have actually followed through. So tell us a little bit about that element of moral panic. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It's one we've discussed a lot in the newsroom here. The sense of the roof caving in at Twitter, for about 5 days, it felt like everything was falling apart. Right, you had Elon had taken over. He did that, ludicrous thing with the sink on the way into the office. I don't know if you saw that, and it seemed like a big joke to him as he was taking over. That concerned people. Then you had the layoffs, which was some of the most remarkably brutal sequence of events I've come across, and there was that ludicrous situation where you had some people who've been laid off being told, oh, actually we need you, come back again. I mean, that was just pandemonium, not the sort of thing you'd expect from a big tech company like Twitter. And so that within the users, you're right, this created this sort of panic, not without some level of justification, I don't think. I think when several journalists were banned that evening, I think that should have been a big warning sign to lots of people that this isn't old Twitter. There isn't this at least lip service to this idea of press freedom. That was an act against press freedom. And even though some of those journalists, well, all the journalists have been reinstated, there are still restrictions, I believe, on some of their accounts. Which that is anti freedom of the press, and I think that there isn't. That shouldn't be underestimated. That said, there is, I think over time, if Twitter continues to remain stable as a platform, i.e. it's not, failing and things breaking, then that's fine. Engagement doesn't seem to have suffered greatly, although I do wonder to what degree that's, quality engagement anymore. I think some of the tweets I'm being served by the algorithm seem like fast food rather than good information. And then also this, the kind of speaking to the subject today, the lack of somewhere else to go might also be Twitter's sort of strongest protection right now. So I think you're right. There has been this panic, not without justification, but I think we might be entering a phase here where the initial shock, and it was shock that Elon took over this website, and some of the early things he did, I think there might be subsiding slightly, just like almost any story in the news agenda might kind of chill out after a little while. I think the proof in the pudding will be, I mean, you mentioned Facebook. Well, it's a really interesting example, Facebook, because unlike Twitter, nobody on Facebook declares they're leaving. Well, some people do, but not. People don't say, "Right, I'm leaving Facebook, delete everything." They just stop using it. And I don't know how you guys feel about Facebook, but at no point did I say, "Right, I'm stopping using Facebook today." But I can go weeks now without logging into the main app. Now, sure, I'm still using WhatsApp, I'm still using Instagram, etc. But the way that a social network dies isn't people quitting; it's just people not returning. In that sort of muscle memory kind of way. And I think Twitter could risk that happening, but that takes a lot longer to see. Arguably, that's been Facebook for the last 3, maybe 5 years. It's taken that long for the graph to do this for Facebook, which is why they stopped sharing the graph incidentally. So it takes time, I think, for us to really understand whether people are going to leave and move somewhere else.
Yeah, there's a reason Marissa used to harp on at us about daily habits, and trying to create daily habits among users. I'm going to stay on this moral panic question with a similar veined question from Anina Kleisen in the Zoom audience, who says many journalists I've spoken to are talking about the decision to leave Twitter in ethical terms, like questioning whether or not to join a boycott of a company they don't support. But there are also practical difficulties after Musk's takeover, most dramatic being censorship, suspended accounts. For you, is the discussion on whether or not to stay on Twitter more of an ethical one or more of a pragmatic decision? Where's your red line?
I don't know if I have a red line. Maybe I should. I can't picture what that red line would. I mean, myself being banned would be a red line, but that's more of an enforced, one, isn't it?
It's very pragmatic.
I can pretend that's a principle, but I wouldn't have much to do about it. I mean, look, I think I don't think it needs to be necessarily black and white. I think I've consciously. I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and say I can just abandon Twitter, because I mean I could, but like I don't want to, right? It's still a very important outlay for my work. When I publish a story, I still want to go on there and share it. But there are degrees of stepping back. I don't think I tweet as much, or at least I don't tweet as much about things that have any sort of substance. I wouldn't, for example, the Elon Musk trial the other day, good example. I was doing more commentary on Mastodon than I was on Twitter. Not as so much a boycott, but just because Mastodon seemed like a friendlier, more useful outlet for that. But then other thing, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I said I wrote a tweet that got me a mild bit of hot water a little while ago, but the idea that I would start paying $8 a month for Twitter, forget it. This is a company that its CEO regularly sort of shows contempt for the industry that I'm in. And so while that might seem hollow, given I'm still using Twitter, I think I can still use Twitter and take some comfort in not supporting that new business model necessarily. So yeah, the boycotting thing, I think it's a different question. I think it's a very individual question. I think there's people whose professional lives are very dependent on being on Twitter, whether they want it to be or not. And so I don't think it's not like a moral boycott of some company where you can just cut them out of your life. Yeah. It's a bit more complicated than that. And we should, I think we should be quite lenient with people in our sort of network in how they each decide how to move forward with using Twitter.
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it, and a perfect segue to a comment from Zariri Rahman in Malaysia. And I'll be honest, this is the thorn in my side. Zariri says, I've been hearing a lot about the exodus of journalists from Twitter, but here in Malaysia, there's little sign of things slowing down, aside from complaints about the algorithm and the For You tab on the app. Do you think this so-called exodus or panic is more prominent in the Western world? Because Twitter's been valuable for journos in the developing world, and in their opinion, its demise would be unfathomable. And are we perhaps having this conversation from a very northern perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And we talk, particularly in the US, we talk about the importance to journalists here and in the UK or wherever as a way for our stories to get out there to people. But if you're a journalist internationally, that's magnified even more, right? I mean, there's a way for journalists doing really important work in countries perhaps less on the Western media's radar, or at least the American and British media radar. And Twitter's an incredibly good way of finding that network without having to, I don't know, pay for advertising or distribute a newspaper in London or whatever. So yeah, I think it's when we talk about it in those terms, I think it's actually really sad, isn't it? I mean, this is something that has built up as an incredibly useful tool for reporters, and one that's important for the democratic process in many places, has been harmful to it as well. Let's not forget. So there's two sides to that. One concern I would have for I'm going to say international users. Of course, we're all international from somewhere, but you take my point. Is that I've yet to see Elon show any indication other than layoffs that he realizes that Twitter's an internationally used app. As far as every conversation on censorship, as far as every conversation on moderation, it's all been through the lens of US politics, Elon Musk's own world. Features he's putting in place are ones that are solving problems he himself just has on Twitter, which is a kind of a strength. I quite like a CEO doing that, but at the same time, it's quite narrow. One thing I'd be very worried about for people in countries outside the main markets for Twitter is just neglect, really. Twitter had good moderators that were dealing, not perfectly, but at least attempting to deal with these markets, with content that the moderation team in the US just simply wouldn't understand, whether just from a language barrier or just context barrier. And so neglect, I think, is a real issue, because I think Twitter could become quite sort of dangerous for slightly more off the radar markets. And so I think so. Sorry, I forget the name of who sent the question, but I think it's a very, very, very good point.
Very good point. And when you and I were chatting ahead of this seminar, you said, what was my red line? Why did I leave the platform? And I couldn't remember, but Zarira reminds me it was within the detail of the verification scheme was the fact that it was being rolled out to iPhone users in the US, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and Australia. And that just triggered the global South immigrant in me, like, oh, okay, I see. Oh, we're playing that game again 100, 200 years later.
I think it's certainly there's two trains of thought on that. I think there's one that says I think there's a lot of people who actually don't like Musk, who actually quite like the fact that he's managed to speed up product development at Twitter dramatically from the Jack Dorsey days, which isn't saying much, frankly, but still there's more new things happening on Twitter. And one of the ways he's done that is to kind of ignore these complications, right? Of different markets. And I think frankly a lot of that, the markets that they went with, is as much about payment technology and availability than it is about any sort of discussion about what country should have it and which isn't. I think it's more about whether Stripe, the payment providers, will actually sort of take payments in certain ways. But I would hazard a guess that the old Twitter would have a little more to what you're talking of the sort of the historical importance of making sure everyone's on an equal footing as far as possible. So that's these things are important. And if you're in the business of building communities, then treating those communities fairly is got to be right up there. And that's perhaps not something that the new administration thinks about quite so often.
Fair. Let's go to Jussi downstairs from Finland.
Hello, thank you very much for talking to us today. You mentioned earlier that one thing that worked for journalists on Twitter was kind of opening up the journalistic behind-the-scenes stuff, and this is what is happening while I'm creating this story. And maybe that's something that we should do more on other platforms as well. I was wondering, what kind of thoughts do you have on which parts of our behind the scenes work we should be more transparent about, and what should be kept private? And how do you see that the possible increased transparency could lead to perhaps more trust from the audience?
Interesting question. What should and should not be leveraged?
Yeah, I mean, so the should nots are easier. Like, I mean, obviously, making sure you protect sort of sourcing and some of the elements of news that, when you cover tech companies, for example, you do get a lot of, the sort of background calls, all that kind of stuff, which drives me crazy, but sadly it's become like a necessary part of reporting on the industry. So there's things that you can't necessarily be as open as one might like to be. But I think a lot of the process is feels quite unremarkable to journalists. But I think, I think we might have all been in those situations where either you're at a dinner party or just talking with friends who are, very successful in whatever they do. But when they ask you about the media, you just think, gosh, you've got no idea how this works, right? I mean, I get people say to me, well, do you just get told what stories to do? And I go, well, no, not really. It's a collaboration. And, if I just waited to be told what story I was doing, I'd soon be fired from the newspaper. And also, I think people don't necessarily understand how it is that certain voices get in a story, how it is that certain voices don't get in a story, what our process is for anonymous sourcing. I think that's always one that I was talking to someone recently who thought that when I say things like, according to an Amazon employee who asked not to be named, they assumed that I didn't know who it was either. And I was like, no, of course I know who it is. I'm just not sharing it with the reader. And I think dispelling some of these myths kind of gradually, I think is really, really useful. And the more people know about the process, I think the better. And Twitter was a revolution in that regard. And I think one of the things that stood out from Twitter is that, and this still stands today, is that early on, a lot of news organizations said, well, don't worry about putting each individual journalist on Twitter. Let's just have an account for the publication. Let's have @BBC News or @Vice or whatever. And they soon realized that people weren't interested necessarily in following those accounts. They wanted the individual journalists. They wanted to be able to, talk to the journalists and wanted to hear what they were thinking, what they were reading, and how that sort of building their reporting and their view, or just their perspective, or however you want to put it. So I think it's just about the process. I'm firmly of the belief that even the biggest skeptic about the mainstream, particularly the mainstream media and how it works, if they could just spend one day in a newsroom, right, and just see the lengths that journalists have to go to publish a story or to broadcast a story, I think it would change their entire view of the integrity of good newsrooms, right? And obviously all newsrooms are different, but the trustworthy publications and broadcasters, it's remarkable how much effort goes in. One good example of this, actually, I don't know if you guys have seen or read. So She Said, the book written by Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohey, the New York Times reporters who did the story on Harvey Weinstein. Fantastic book, one of the best books about the process of journalism I've ever read. And they know what Harvey Weinstein did within about 10 pages of that book. The rest of the book is the process of being able to put that in the New York Times. And I think anyone reading that just kind of gets it then. They think, right, well, this is how difficult that is. And the act of journalism isn't knowing something, it's publishing something. And then that's where sharing some of these things is along the way. Obviously for Weinstein it's different, you can't necessarily do it on the way, but sharing more about how we do our jobs is a huge reason, I think, to be on any social media, whether it's Twitter, Mastodon or whatever.
Dave, if journalism is not the act of knowing something but of publishing something, at what point does your social media count as publishing something? At what point is your social media content journalism, and vice versa?
I mean, a lot of my I was talking about the merits of Tony Braxton's 90s singles yesterday. I'm not sure that counts as journalism. But I mean, look, anything. I had a weird relationship with Twitter early on where I used to have two accounts. One was my personal account, and then I had Dave Lee BBC, which had a very strange a process at the time where I had an editor who wasn't able to pre-read my official BBC tweets, but would get a text each time I did with the tweet in it. And thankfully, only once did I get told off for something I tweeted on that account. And so everything that if you're a journalist, then everything should be something. Well, the rule of the BBC was, don't tweet anything that you wouldn't say on air. And I thought that was always quite a good rule of thumb. And yeah, I think you've got to be mindful that on the one hand, we can't say, it's important for journalists to be on social media. It's good for trust. It's good for quality of information, and not take that seriously at every turn ourselves. Because everything that whenever we don't do that, we just undermine our presence there. So yeah, I think it is journalism in that sense, i.e., it needs to be true and not bad.
Yeah, there are two more things I really want to cover that are not necessarily about Twitter or Twitter alternatives. And the first is ChatGPT, and the second is all the layoffs. So let's go in on the layoffs first. What's going on in San Francisco and Silicon Valley and Sunnyvale? What's with all the layoffs, and what should we be watching?
I think we should be watching for this not being over. I think, fundamentally what happened is during the pandemic, these companies found that there's all these workers willing to move and change. And they just hired like crazy, absolutely crazy. Amazon went from 800,000 employees to 1.6 million employees in just over a year. I mean, that's remarkable. You had Meta adding thousands upon thousands of engineers and all sorts, and they did so partly, I think, because they were worried that if they didn't, other companies would get the talent they wanted. Also, they did it because they could, right? Stock was going crazy, optimism was high. There seemed like there was money to be spent. And they also, the third thing, the crucial thing, which is the big mistake, is they seemed to think that some pandemic elements of how we were living were going to hold in a way they haven't. In Amazon's case, e-commerce went through the roof during the pandemic, obviously, and then came crashing back down to earth, a year later, a year and a half later. And so now all these companies are seeing their stock price drop dramatically, and all of a sudden the investors who previously were saying, okay, growth is the thing we look for when you bring out your earnings. We say how many new users, how much new revenue. That used to be what investors looked at when they looked at tech stocks. Now what they look at is profitability. And when you're a company like Amazon, which sort of flip-flops between profit and loss quite liberally, famously didn't make a profit for years and years and years as a public company, that can be a problem, because it's almost as if you're a student going to a test, and we're going to test you based on your skill of this, and then halfway through the test they say, actually now we care more about this, and the other thing is kind of opposed, not all the time, but often opposed to the first, and that's what we're seeing now. I hope that this is short-lived, because I think a lot of the layoff, a lot of the people being laid off are in some of the areas that technology companies are experimenting and trying big ideas. And I know that Amazon gets a lot of stick for the quality of, I don't want to say its name because it's going to go off, but the quality of its voice assistant. But I like the idea that Amazon would sort of invest in that kind of tech, because I think it could be very useful to a lot of people, privacy concerns aside. And it's teams like Alexa that have had their teams kind of gutted slightly by this round of layoffs. So yeah, I do think it's important, though, just a final thing on that. If you were to do a graph of all these companies and their employees, they've done this over the last few years, and the layoffs are just this little nub at the end where they are making a few adjustments at the moment, but it might not be over.
So it's more a contraction of an expansion that happened during the pandemic, and not some kind of forebear that they know something about an impending recession that we don't.
Honestly, I think that the layoffs are as much about signaling to Wall Street that they're trying to rein in costs. I think there's also a number of activist investors that are approaching these companies. Google, Salesforce, the other day gained a very powerful new activist investor, and they just want to say to those people, we're not overspending. I think actually the layoffs are more an indication they don't know what's coming than they do. I think if they did know what's coming, they could be a bit more calculated about it than they are. The fact that all these layoffs are happening within 2-3 weeks of each other is no coincidence. It's every company going, well, they're doing it, so that's the expectation. This is what Wall Street thinks. That's a big driver of this, I think.
Okay. And then ChatGPT, the new kind of tech darling.
I love it.
What is your take on are we all going to lose our jobs? How can we be incorporating ChatGPT into our journalism? I mean, it's a very big, broad, crazy question to ask right at the end, but what are your kind of key takeaways on ChatGPT at the moment?
I think it's awesome. I think absolutely awesome. And I would urge everyone to sort of try ChatGPT if you're not doing it already, but also just some of the sort of applications that are being built with ChatGPT. Unfortunately, they've sort of introduced sort of paid plans for it in the last few days. So it's a bit less accessible than it might have been. But I think it's fascinating. And I think we're going to need to learn how to use it in a responsible way. I do think there is a big application for journalists. I like the idea that, you know, if you're rushing a story and what you need at the bottom is just some context about something, you can just perhaps sort of put in a few keywords and that context can be generated. Of course, the downside is that it might be wrong, right? The context might be wrong. Yeah. But, you know, that's only going to get better. And I think, you know, one of the criticisms of ChatGPT is that it's built from so many sources, it's unreliable. But what if you can apply the same technology, for instance, to just articles in the FT, so that when I write a story for the FT, I know that the information is solid, right? And you know, can be trusted. So I think the applications there are absolutely huge. I don't think it's putting anyone out of a job. I think it's changing the nature of jobs, but I would say to people, you know, if you're, and we've seen this begin to happen already. There'll be stories now about, oh, ChatGPT's been able to do this, and oh my God, that means great. Like there was one the other day, ChatGPT passed a doctor exam, some examination for doctors. Proves to not entirely be true anyway. But the principle of, oh well, if the AI can be as clever as a doctor, then fine. Well, no, of course it can't, right? I mean, and also we need to separate things that are difficult for humans to do from things that are difficult for machines to do. Yeah. I think robotics is a good example of this. Robotics can do some of the most complex, intricate bits of, you know, machinery or building that a human could never do. But one thing robots can't do is pick up a bottle like this and put it down with relative ease, right? So there's different traits of our species and and theirs that are going to persist for decades and perhaps may never be solved. So you know, we're not under a huge amount of threat from these things. In fact, I think it's a massive productivity tool. I talk to developers here who are using Microsoft's AI for coding, and they say it's just transformed what they're doing because they're able to find mistakes more quickly. They're able to, you know, if anyone has ever done any kind of coding, like it's finding the comma that's gone somewhere. You know, that's so much time in this process, and so AI can help with that. So I think we need to be cognizant of the risks and some of the drawbacks of this tech. I think we need to be quite mature about some of the problems of this tech. I mean, it's gonna accidentally say offensive things, it's going to make big mistakes, it's going to plagiarize people's work, and we need to say, okay, that's bad, but let's just keep calm about these things and see how we can improve, because ultimately it's coming, and so we just want it to be as good as possible. But yeah, I think it's, of all the things in the past 3 or 4 years, I think it's one of the most exciting innovations I've seen.
Brilliant. Dave, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a brilliant hour spent with you. Irony of all ironies, I now have to say that if anyone's interested in applying for the Journalism Fellowship Program but has questions, we'll be holding a Twitter space tomorrow at 1 p.m. where you can come and ask all of your questions. So after all of that conversation, find us on Twitter. And And next week, we're joined by Caleb Okereke from Minority Report to talk about how data journalism has empowered them to report on LGBTQ issues in Africa. Thank you very, very, very much once again, Dave. And my just parting thought for you is, Alexa, please play Tony Braxton. Did it work? Did it work?
You've been busted.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But I will ask it. I'll ask it on your behalf in a moment.
Thanks, Dave. Go well and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone. It was really fun doing this.
Bye.
Bye.